Support for Conversations Live comes from the members of WPSU and from the Penn State Alumni Association, informing, involving, and inspiring Penn State alumni and friends worldwide through programs, events, and communications.
Good evening and welcome to Conversations Live, Privatization. I'm Patty Satalia. Increasingly, cash-strapped cities and states are selling off public assets and services in exchange for lump sums of money. Proponents say the private sector can do many things better than the government, and usually for less money. Critics say privatization exploits financial hardship, undermines democracy, and in the long run, costs taxpayers money. Tonight, we'll talk about the benefits and risks of privatizing government services and assets. You can join the conversation. Our toll-free number is 1-800-543-8242, and our email address is connect@wpsu.org. If you'd like to join us on Twitter, you can tweet a question to @WPSU. Now, let me introduce tonight's guests. Stephen Herzenberg is an economist and executive director of the Keystone Research Center, an independent think tank in Harrisburg. Leo Knepper is executive director of Citizens Alliance of Pennsylvania, a nonprofit conservative think tank headquartered in Lemoyne that advocates for limited government, economic freedom, and personal responsibility. Ellen Dannon is the Fannie Weiss Distinguished Professor of Law at Penn State and a leading expert on public-private partnerships. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. It seems that there is no limit to what's being considered for privatization all across the country. Everything from parking meters to schools, liquor sales, even prisons are being privatized. But before we talk about some of the specific so-called public-private partnerships that are out there these days, I think it's important to find out why certain things have historically been seen as public responsibilities and therefore in the public domain, while others have been left to private enterprise.
Well, when I look out at what has happened in terms of what's public and what's private, there's been a natural experiment about allocating these various services, and that experiment basically looks at, it depends on whether there's competition in that particular area. So if there's competition, you have these market forces that are really helpful in imposing accountability on the, whatever this entity is. Competition is the sort of thing that, if you don't keep doing a better job for less money, your competitors are going to eat your lunch. Sometimes there are things that are just natural monopolies. You can only really have one of them, and there are, examples that can be given, but basically that's the idea. And if you've got a monopoly, then you don't have competition, you don't have that kind of accountability. And so what has ended up happening is that those natural monopolies end up in the public sector, where we can impose accountability on them using things like Freedom of Information Act, Open Meetings Acts, and all sorts of regulations that we put on them.
What happens, Stephen Herzenberg, when a public monopoly becomes a private monopoly? Well, in other words, there's no competition, as Professor Dannon says.
It's probably easier to think in terms of a specific example, and I'll give you some Pennsylvania examples. So there are a fairly large number of water and sewer systems in Pennsylvania that have been privatized, where there's like a long-term lease, so that the private operator is providing the services for 75 years. And the research on that is pretty straightforward. Rates go up a lot. So in a sense, the privatization becomes a backdoor tax hike. So that's one of the general problems, is that when a private company is in the business to make money, and so unless you're extremely careful in structuring a deal for a private monopoly, then they are going to make as much money as they can, and taxpayers are going to end up paying more, indirectly in that case through rates. So you see the same thing. We did a study of school bus privatization and found that over a 26-year period, it was more costly if you privatize. But that's a case where sometimes when a school district privatizes its transportation services, they sell their buses.
So reclaiming this is very, very difficult.
They sell the asset, so they get a pile of money up front. That's great. But then suddenly you're locked into a contract with a private operator. In many places, particularly rural areas, there's not
a lot of
competition. Now, in order to bring it back in-house, if you're getting gouged, then you have to find the capital to buy a new fleet of buses. So that's a general danger.
You even say there's a perverse incentive that the state actually reimburses school districts at a higher rate when they are contracting out for school bus services than if they were using in-house school bus services.
This is a bizarre accident of history in Pennsylvania when it comes to that particular service, which is school bus transportation services. Yes, you get more money as a school district if you're contracting out the services. This obviously has reinforced a tendency
over time.
Which,
of course, means taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, ends up costing more money.
Now, Leo Knepper, you say that public-private partnerships are a good deal for governments and good deal for investors. How so?
Absolutely. And even just returning to Mr. Herzenberg's, the issue of water and sewer. One of the reasons that water and sewer rates increase over an extended period of time actually has to do with the amount of government regulations that are put on particularly sewage processors. If you take a look at federal regulations when it comes to the amount of nitrogen discharge and things of that nature, a lot of local sewage processors, sewage authorities have actually had to undergo incredibly expensive upgrades to their system to very little benefit in terms of the outflow.
But what if the government raised the rates themselves rather than contracting out this service and paying a contractor more for it?
Well, it's not even an issue of the contractor has costs that it has to recoup, through anything. If you are taking a look at the parking authorities are a good example. There are certain things that they have to be able to recoup, and that is written into the contract. Where things get challenging is when the contract is written and they have the ability to increase rates and things of that nature, and government, through additional regulation, actually increases the costs. That's what gets passed on to the consumer. It's not necessarily that their consumers are getting gouged. It's that the input prices are going up.
Are there any public assets or infrastructure that you consider should not be privatized, that it's such an important or public asset for whatever reason that it isn't a good candidate for privatization?
That's actually a really good question. There aren't a lot that come to mind that wouldn't benefit from some level of public-private partnership. Even if you take a look at like road maintenance and road contracts, the state of New Jersey is actually experimenting. Governor Christie bid out some of the road maintenance contracts to private enterprises to see what kind of rates they could get. So there are a lot of things that I would have to sit down and really think about, should we not do this? I guess national defense would probably be, let's not contract out the Army, but there aren't a lot of things that couldn't benefit from private involvement with it.
Professor Dannon, you say that there are certain things, infrastructure in particular, in which privatizing is problematic. Explain why.
Yeah, a few years ago, I decided I wanted to, it was about the time that the Turnpike was up for privatization, and I could see that interesting things were happening, but I couldn't figure out exactly what exactly was going on. So I decided to get a number of privatization contracts, infrastructure privatization contracts, and read through them. And let me just say, you get combat pay, or you should get combat pay for reading through them. And one of the things that I found is that a number of the provisions there basically guarantee the private contractor income. And for example, well, I don't know if you want me to go into some examples of that.
Absolutely.
At this point, but yeah, so for example, if you take Harrisburg and you look at the Harrisburg parking garages, which have, there was a big push to privatize them. I'm sure that there would be an adverse action provision in those contracts. There are in other parking contracts. And what they would say is that if anything is done by the government, or it allows anything to happen that decreases the revenues of the private contractor, that those must be made up. So you look at the private, you look at those parking garages, had they been privatized, let's say that Harrisburg decided to put in a much better mass transit system, which would be great because the traffic there is horrible.
So now people aren't parking
because they are not using cars. That would then give that private contractor the right to exercise their options under those adverse action provisions and demand the money that they would have gotten on into the future.
And in fact, this adverse action that you're talking about is exactly what happened in Chicago when they privatized their parking meters.
Right.
When the city of Chicago closed the roads for a fair or closed the roads for road repairs, the contractor billed the city.
Right. So, and not only that, but they build them as though those meters were occupied for the full time that you had to pay fares, and
the
that
full
would be
time as in 24 hours.
If it were 24 hours, usually you don't have to put that in, but for the whole time that those were available. So they've got that's part of what I say is they really can't lose on these things. I've talked to some people in Chicago and about these issues, and one of the things that they've said is that it's really destroyed a lot of these traditional street fares because people just can't afford it because of the parking rates.
Leo Nipper, how do you respond to what she's saying?
Well, I guess that has a lot to do with, as you mentioned, the contract construction. So it's ultimately the responsibility of the elected officials who are negotiating these contracts to vet them, to make sure that while there are going to be certain things that, if something happens with regards to mass transit or something like that, that's something that the government should be building into the contracts, so that they don't have to pay for those things.
There are many, Leo Nipper, who say, though, that it's an imbalance of power, that you've got the smartest guy in the room, for example, the Morgan Stanleys, Stanley Morgans, I do this every time, against public officials who don't have the financial savvy, and so they're often taken in these kinds of deals. How do you respond to that charge?
They need to hire a better lawyer. I mean, that's kind of what it boils down to. If you're looking at contracting out a 100-year, 50-year agreement with an organization, it's going to pay for you up front to hire a good attorney to vet the contract and to let you know in English what it entails.
Is that what typically happens, Steve Herzenberg? Who's giving advice to government officials on these things?
Well, often it's private companies that are, in much of the rest of their business, they're in tight with the private infrastructure companies, so there's often a conflict of interest in terms of the advice they're giving government. But I think the broader issue here is that obviously in very long infrastructure deals, negotiating a good contract, anticipating all contingencies, all possible future states of the world over the next 75 years is difficult, shall we say impossible. But the broader issue here is even on a lot of other types of contracting where you're not got a long-term lease, contracts and monitoring are difficult and expensive. So that's why in many cases privatization ends up not giving you the benefits that you expect. I'll give another concrete example. Governor Rendell, a series of governors, but Governor Rendell in particular, contracted out a great deal of information technology services in Harrisburg to Deloitte Touche, which, not surprisingly, gives a lot of money to political candidates. What ends up there happening is that if you end up with a state agency that's contracting most of its IT services, it no longer has a professional staff inside that has the expertise to know when the hours they're billing to rewrite code for a 15-year-old computer language that nobody else except that particular group of people in Deloitte know anymore. And so, again, this is the general kind of challenge. And so when you properly reconcile with the monitoring costs, the danger of being taken, then in fact it ends up making more sense to know, let's keep the work in-house, let's hire good people, let's train them, we'll get better value for money that way.
We have some comments, but I want to first do a quick reset and invite our first caller, and we'll go back to both of you. If you're just joining us, I'm Patty Satalia, and this is Conversations Live. Privatization on WPSU TV and WPSU FM. Our guests are Steve Herzenberg, Executive Director of the Keystone Research Center, Leo Knepper, Executive Director of Citizens Alliance of Pennsylvania, and Professor Ellen Dannon from the Penn State School of Law. Our telephone number is 1-800-543-8242, and our guests are ready to take your calls. You may also email your question to connect@wpsu.org, or if you'd like to join us on Twitter, you can tweet a question to @WPSU. We'll take our first call. It's from Rick in State College. Go ahead, please, Rick.
Thank you very much. I'd like to comment on two subjects. The first is roads, and the second is alcohol. I think Europe does it much better with roads in the fact that the roads are built by very large construction companies who, in addition to building the roads, are expected to maintain the very same roads they build for a fixed period of time. And that gives them the incentive to do it right. As far as liquor is concerned, when I lived in California, beer and wine were sold in the supermarkets, but the supermarkets were allowed to buy directly from the manufacturers and compete with one another. The way the proposal to pass out liquor licenses now, I don't think will benefit the public. It's just an attempt to create a new class of donors to the politicians who are running for office.
All right, interesting points. Ellen, do you want to respond first?
Sure. You know, it's an interesting question that he raises, and I've lived now in a number of states, including California, and you're absolutely right. I could go to the mom and pop store around the corner from where I lived, and I could get you know, any kind of alcohol, hard alcohol, if I wanted to, from that mom and pop store. One of the things that I think we need to take into consideration is what are the costs that are associated with any form of privatization, or whether you put something in the public sector versus the private sector.
So in other words, a really in-depth cost-benefit analysis needs to be done.
Right, and in the case of alcohol, now I'm not a teetotaler, let me just make that clear. I'm also not a lush. But when you think about alcohol, there are a lot of harms that come from alcohol. You know, it's associated with all kinds of diseases from drinking. It's strongly associated with family disputes and violence, and also accidents of all kinds, you know, automobile accidents, etc. So, you know, it's not necessarily the best thing. You know, there's that competition there that I talked about earlier. There's that incentive to get more money by the, you know, the private merchant, but in this case, selling more is not necessarily in the public interest, and we need to find a way to balance that out.
We'll let Leo respond.
I would actually agree that there are social consequences to privatizing alcohol. However, when you take a look at Pennsylvania versus the 6 kind of neighboring states, we actually do worse when it comes to the level of binge drinking, when it comes to the level of alcohol-related fatalities from automobiles.
I read the opposite about Pennsylvania and auto accidents.
No, Pennsylvania ranks higher. Basically, there are 2 ways that the CDC classifies alcohol issues. There's alcohol-related and alcohol-attributable deaths. When you look at the broader alcohol-attributable, Pennsylvania does worse than 4 out of the 6 surrounding states.
Well, what's interesting is the CDC recommends not privatizing in states where there's already government control.
But there has also been members of the CDC who have come back and said that there's really no evidence either way that it's going to make a difference.
What you're citing is a national public health task force, which, with all due respect, is the consensus of the academic public health community that privatization of retail alcohol distribution is likely to lead to more alcohol abuse and to more related social problems. In terms of the alcohol fatalities, my labor economist, Mark Price, reanalyzed a piece of work that had been put out by another conservative think tank, the Commonwealth Foundation, and they looked at alcohol fatalities across states and left out basic controls. They left out how many miles you drive, and they left out the income of the state, which is correlated with how new and how safe cars are. Sure, if you do lousy statistics, can you reach the conclusion you want to in terms of alcohol control doesn't save lives? Yes. When you do the statistics right, as Mark did, then you find that I think our estimate was if we privatized completely, it would be 58 more people dying in alcohol-related fatalities in Pennsylvania. So that's the trade-off.
Well, let me ask this, because the Pennsylvania liquor sales in Pennsylvania are a moneymaker for the state. If that's the case, what's the benefit to the state in privatizing? Although I do think in some respects buying alcohol in Pennsylvania can be inconvenient. But the question, I guess, is, could we modernize rather than privatize? We
are working with a system that was established after Prohibition by the governor at the time, who wanted to make alcohol consumption as difficult as possible. We can't, saying let's modernize the Pennsylvania system is akin to saying, well, let's just modernize the horses and buggies that we use. We are so far behind the rest of the country in terms of how we operate the system. And with due respect, the fact that, you know, your organization, which is, you know, incredibly pro-labor, you have almost all of your board, not almost all, but a very large number of your board members are from either government sector or public sector or private sector unions. The fact that your organization came up with a different read on the numbers, everybody has a bias. So, as you mentioned, you can make the numbers say whatever you want. What it boils down to is the proper role of government selling alcohol.
No, I said you could make the numbers say whatever you want, is what I said. And your colleagues, say you did, your colleagues at the Commonwealth Foundation did, you know, to their credit, since we came out with a searing and accurate critique of their work, they haven't repeated that. But anyway, so.
Should the government sell alcohol? Is that the core function of government?
I think that's a fair argument. Should the government sell alcohol? But I still wonder how you reconcile the CDC's recommendation. If your government is in the policy of controlling liquor, they advise against changing that because of social problems.
48 other states have managed not to implode, and Pennsylvania, I think we'd be all right.
Okay, let me take this next call. Kate is calling us from Center County. Kate, you're on the air.
Hi. In the civil service employees in Pennsylvania are prohibited against campaigning for candidates in the sense that the politicians are not allowed to coerce the employees into people who happen to be civil service employees at the time into campaigning on their behalf. Recently, a judge and a state senator were tried for requiring employees to do campaign work on state time. Okay, so we know in the civil service there's a protection from for the employees that they can concentrate on their jobs and not be patronage employees. So now when we're talking about privatization and contracting out and sale of state contracts and possibly state property, what is built into the law that protects the people of Pennsylvania from the money going around in a circle or from political influence being required of the contact recipient and that sort of thing?
The accountability question is really, I think, what she's asking. Ellen Dannon, how would you respond to that?
Well, once it goes into the private sector, it's going to depend on how the contract is written, but I'm going to assume that those things are, you know, private. Once they're privatized, you lose those sorts of laws and regulations that help, you know, they're good governance kind of laws, and you lose all of that once you go into the private sector. You know, and for really important reasons. You look back in the history of the United States, and you can look at Tammany Hall, for example, and just the level of corruption that existed because of that kind of monetary pressure to keep your job.
You have a response.
Yeah, that's based on the premise that they're following the laws that are on the books prohibiting public employees from actually doing those things. You take a look at the recent Turnpike scandal.
The pay-to-play.
Pay-to-play. You take a look at the PLCB in terms of the members of the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board not only accepting gifts from vendors and going on fairly expensive trips.
But some would say that the fact that we know about this shows that right-to-know laws are working in these cases.
The issue is that the more you have government doing business, the more opportunities there are for government those people to be abusing their positions of authorities in order to extract either bribes in the pay-to-play case or other things. There is an incredible incentive for people who are dishonest to go into government because government is involved in so many things and there is a lot of power.
What about the argument, Leo Knepper, that in a public monopoly, the mission is public good, but in a private monopoly, the mission is to make money? And I think this is something that concerns people when public assets become private assets.
Let's take a look at a second, because the caller also mentioned money kind of floating around. It's a reasonable point to bring up. But what we have now is we have a system where government employees, where taxpayers, you and I, are paying to collect union dues for all of the AFL-CIO, AFSCME, everybody who's a state-related union, anybody that's a state employee that is a member of a union, you and I are paying to collect those dues. When you take a look at the amount of money from those dues that is recycled back into lobbying, back into political spending, I would argue that you would probably have less of that money getting recycled back in, because those organizations, government employee unions, depend on the growth of government in order to have either greater membership or the ability to pay higher salaries and generate more dues. When you take a look at the government union bosses, Wendell Young, who runs the UFCW, makes over $200,000 a year.
Tell me about a public-private partnership that you think has been a win-win for the investors and for the public. Name one, because I'm interested, because I've looked at what happened in Chicago and I feel like, wow, there's been a lot of loss on the part of the public.
Well, when you take a look at it, the U.S. is really just starting to get into public-private partnerships. To a larger extent, you actually have greater successes when you take a look at some of the foreign countries. New Zealand did a lot of privatization. European countries, as the other caller had mentioned.
She happens to be an expert on the New Zealand example, but you can't think of one in the U.S. where you say both parties have won. Privatization saved a public asset, and this is benefiting everyone.
Off the top of my head, I don't have one for you.
Okay. Patty, I'd actually like to go back to something that we were going to get back to before you did the reset.
Sure.
And that is to take a look at what happened in terms of giving advice to, in this case, we can look at the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which didn't end up being privatized. So your basic narrative there was that it's, the fault of the people who are involved in these deals.
They need better advice.
They just don't get, they just don't pay enough money to hire people with really good advice. So a few years ago, I did a study looking at what was going on with the Turnpike and its potential privatization. And in fact, they had hired an expert from Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley had been one of the original bidders on the Turnpike, and they didn't make it into the final three. And so Governor Rendell then hired them to be his advisors. So they are now sitting on a lot of, when you look at who's sitting at that table, they've tried to sit at two of at least three parts of that table. And one of the things that I found was that and this is typical for the industry, when those people do need really good advice, who do they go to? As Steve said, they go to people who are from the industry. And not only were they doing, selecting somebody who whose natural inclinations is to make certain that they keep these kinds of deals because they know that on the next time around they are going to be the person who's going to be up to get that deal. Not only that, they were paid with what's called a success fee. A huge part of the remuneration for Morgan Stanley was going to be if that deal went through.
So if the deal isn't consummated, the person who's providing advice to the government doesn't get paid?
They get paid something,
but
this is a huge part of the. So there is a really distorting incentive there. If you think you're going to get $10 an hour for your work, and instead you're going to be getting $100 if this deal goes through, you've got an angel and a devil on each side, each shoulder. You're going to have some real temptations to listen to that devil and not to tell Governor Rendell. You know,
I'm going to let Leo respond, and then I'm going to take the next phone call.
I think that the Pennsylvania Turnpike is a great example of one of the arguments that the opponents of privatization used was that tolls are going to increase.
They have in other places throughout the country.
But if you take a look at how many years running has Pennsylvania had toll increases, when you take a look at the Pennsylvania Turnpike, we have some of the highest operational costs in the country. I think we are the third highest in terms of, we're behind Massachusetts and West Virginia in terms of how inefficient our turnpike is run. And to say that a private management couldn't come in and find a way to save money at the Pennsylvania Turnpike is just, it's silly.
Well, one of the interesting things, and then I want to go to Jim, who's hanging on patiently, is I think it's in Chicago, where a toll road that was privatized, part of the clauses in that contract indicate that the state can't do anything to make free-flowing traffic on parallel roadways. In other words, they want to force everyone up onto the toll road. So repairs on adjacent roads or parallel roads would be cause for compensation to the contractor.
But again, that is something that when the contract was written, that was something that the government entity had agreed to. And to be honest with you...
Perhaps not knowingly. We would hope not knowingly.
But when you take a look at a comparison, do we really want to take a look at Chicago as a best example, just knowing their political history in terms of the political corruption?
Let me just say, I sat down and read a whole bunch of these infrastructure contracts. They are roughly 150 pages, not counting the 400 or 500 pages of attachments, which was what Pennsylvania's was. And they are boilerplate. They are word for word the same for a lot of those 100 pages. So that's the industry standard, and that's what the industry is going to, the advisor is going to advise Ed
So these
Rendell.
adverse action clauses, from your experience, are in a lot of the contracts you've had a chance to look at?
They're in all of them that I've
All
looked
of
at.
them. Okay.
I haven't looked at every single one.
Right.
What's happened now is that you can no longer get them. I tried to get the contract for San Diego when they were, this new road that they were going to be putting in, and I was told, I called, contacted San Diego County, and they said, well, we have to ask Macquarie, who was the private partner, if you can have a copy. Macquarie refused to give me one. Well, there goes your Freedom of Information Act. There goes your access to all kinds of information. It is now impossible to get those contracts. What are they hiding? What are they afraid of?
Let me take this next call. Jim, thank you for your patience. Do you have a question or comment for our panel?
Yes, I have a question for Leo. I would like to know who is CAP, how many citizens are involved, how many donors are involved, and is your organization dues-driven?
CAP, so that's actually, how many citizens are involved is an interesting question. We've had, over the course of the last year, we had over 30,000 people come to our website. We have 3,500 people who regularly receive email updates from us. In terms of donors, north of 200 donors. I think that was basically
the question.
What the question was.
Yeah.
So.
Let me go back to something that that Leo brought up, and he talked about the fact that your organization is funded in part by labor. So let's talk about jobs for a minute. If we were to privatize the lottery, for example, what does that mean in terms of jobs, and why does that matter?
Even though we studied that issue, I frankly don't know what it means in terms of jobs. That wasn't our concern when we analyzed it. The bigger concern there was, I mean, this was a case where the state's privatization advisor, Greenhill, stood to make $30 million if the deal went through, and also had a prior relationship with the only ultimately qualified bidder, Camelot Enterprises, because they'd been in on negotiating the deal whereby Camelot was bought by its current owner. And so this was absolutely one of these cases where it smelled awful from a distance. And then when you looked at the details of that proposed lottery privatization, it looked like the state wasn't getting a very good deal in terms of the rate at which revenues would grow. In fact, they would have grown over the course of 20 years at about the rate of inflation, even though
and they grow quickly in the beginning and then taper off.
They were going to expand the lottery games, which should bring in more revenue. And inflation's not very good when, again, state personal income is growing at much faster, typically, than just inflation. So our concern there was around the revenue impacts on the state, and that it wasn't really a very good financial deal. But given the way you started that question, I got to respond to that a little bit. Okay. My organization was founded in part by organized labor. About half our board is people from unions, the other half is folks from academia, folks from the business community, some lawyers. Our money, some of our money, about 15%, comes from labor unions. Most of our money comes from folks who, whether it's foundations or contracts that are based on the quality of work we do. I think with Leo's organization, I mean, they are a self-professed ideological organization. They believe in shrinking government. You articulated a description that probably comes from them in terms of their goals are basically shrinking government. And so from a policy point of view, we look at them and we think of them as a position in search of a justification. So they're not interested in weighing the benefits and cons of privatization. They're interested in shrinking government. So again, most of our money, not all, I mean, we have a set of values, of which we're absolutely proud of, just as you have a set of values that you're proud of. But most of our money is based on the quality of our work. I would conjecture that most of Leo's money comes basically with an ideological litmus test.
You can respond to that.
I want to just go back to the lottery issue. I read through the proposed lottery contract with Camelot. It has one of those adverse action, or it has a couple of adverse action clauses in it that would prevent any competition. And so supposedly...
Well, the lottery is already a monopoly, though. Who else is doing a lottery? Right,
but if it's privatized, shouldn't we welcome competition? Why are we trying to stamp out competitors? Because only if there's competition, robust competition, should you get this improvement in whatever this good or service is going to be.
Well, why privatize something that's making $1 billion a year run by the state?
I'm not advocating. I'm just saying, but if the theory is that in the private sector you have this competition that is going to drive, that's the driver. It's not just being in the private sector, but it's a fact that you have competition and that if you don't do a good job, your lunch will be eaten.
How do you respond to that, Leo Knepper?
So with regards to kind of your question about how many jobs would be lost, let's just step back for a second and look at that. When did government become an employment agency? Why? And I agree, you know, government employs a lot of people. Is it government's job to just be an employment agency and employ people? The folks who had previously worked for using the lottery as an example, the folks who had worked at the lottery, according to what Camelot's spokespeople said, would be first in line for the jobs.
There's something like 160 employees.
So Camelot is offering the people who were currently there those positions. When you take a look at the employees who are at the state liquor stores, the argument is, well, those people will lose their jobs. If a new operation is coming in, the only people in Pennsylvania who have experience selling wine and spirits are people who work at the Pennsylvania liquor stores. So they automatically have a leg up on the rest of the competition in the market because they're already familiar with the product. So to say that it's just, that these people are going to be, just losing jobs and out on their ears is, it's silly.
Do you have a response to that before I take our next
call? Did we
call?
make that?
I mean,
No,
on the wine and spirits issue,
been
jobs are an important consideration, but at least in our analysis of that issue, and the revenue impact on the state, the fact that the state would lose total revenues that come from that industry, and also the social impacts, including greater alcohol abuse and more traffic fatalities, are the sort of, to us, the central issues. 5,000 middle-class jobs in Pennsylvania, some of which would go away, some of which would become low-wage, dead-end jobs in private wine and spirits retailers or liquor retailers. Yeah, that's an issue, absolutely worth considering, but it's not. For us, it wasn't sort of the first issue, or by any means the only issue on which you should make that decision. You should look at a full range of public impacts in weighing any privatization decision.
So we, again, disagree that it's going to have that negative impact. When you take a look at the states that are surrounding Pennsylvania, we already are either 5th or 4th in terms of fatalities and issues related to alcohol consumption. When you take a look at the issue of employment, to say you're ignoring the possibility or the opportunity that then presents itself for an entrepreneur to come in and have a specialty wine or a specialty liquor store as a result of the privatization. So you are, through the current system, you are prohibiting entrepreneurs from creating something that is better than what the state offers. Now, will the people who are currently working at the state liquor stores, will they be those same entrepreneurs who start a wine boutique? Maybe, maybe not. But there are additional opportunities that are available through the privatization process, particularly with alcohol.
Let me take this next caller. Lee is calling us from Johnstown. Go ahead, please.
I have two questions. The first question is, in its present form, will not the final result be that licensees will be virtually all held by large corporations and that there will be effectively no opportunity for a private individual to acquire a license?
No.
I see people nodding yes and no. So Leo, you respond, and then Steve Herzenberg.
No, the way that the law is written, companies can only hold 5 licenses statewide.
So I would say this caller and actually one previous caller who raised a question about the way this particular privatization is shaped, their real argument is, aren't we exchanging a public monopoly for a private monopoly or oligopoly? In other words, the way the deal is structured, it won't really be the quote market where we get accountability from full competition.
Well, getting a license too is quite expensive, so I can't imagine that they're...
So there may be some checks in the proposal that limit the degree of concentration statewide, but again, within particular areas, you're not going to have the kind of competition you want. So the normal free market arguments for competition really won't apply to that that proposal. So when you add that to the fact that we think the evidence shows you're going to lose, the state's going to lose in terms of revenue, the state's going to lose to some degree in terms of social impacts, then, and you're not getting all of these consumer benefits, why again are we doing this?
And then I'll get to your second question.
I would love
Lee.
to see Pennsylvania have a complete free market system in terms of liquor sales, but at this point we already have private monopolies when it comes to beer distribution in Pennsylvania. We have just an absurd system that it could really benefit even from a minimal injection of competition.
So would you be a strong proponent of antitrust laws, much more rigorous antitrust laws to really break up these monopolies?
No. Monopolies come into existence primarily because it's cost effective. It's more to do with the level of government regulation than it is anything else.
I don't know that that's the way things worked back in the days before antitrust laws in the United States.
He's not a Teddy Roosevelt Republican.
Let me let Lee ask the second part of your question. Go ahead, please, Lee.
Well, the second question actually does lean toward the situation with beer distributors. Is it true that beer distributors will have an advantage in the acquisition of a license, and why? And if it is true that beer distributors will have that advantage, will they be able to have satellite locations, as most beer distributors are located in sort of warehouse-type districts and not in retail-friendly locations?
Leo?
I think they did build in some advantages for beer distributors, at least in the early years, for the blatant political reason that they're trying to break the coalition that's been opposed politically to privatization. Long term, it's my understanding that the beer distributors wouldn't have an advantage, which is part of why most of them are still skeptical.
Okay.
Slightly different answer to the first part. The argument is that beer distributors purchased a license with the expectation of a state-granted monopoly. What the state did was it lowered their initial buy-in cost and also gave them the first right of refusal. And yes, part of it does have to do with trying to get them to buy into the privatization.
Okay, we go to Gene, who has wisely pulled off the road. He was driving, listening to our program, pulled off the road to call in. Thank you for doing that. Gene from Lock Haven, what's your question or comment, please?
My comment is just, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
We recently had a nice water company down here in the Lock Haven area, not Lock Haven, and it was privatized. And my sister happens to live where that water company is, and they called the water was brown. It was just horrible. It went from night to day as far as quality. And the new private owner said, hey, that's tough. We meet minimum government standards, take it or leave it. So there's a case where the public-private people actually went to a worse water supply by selling the company.
Steve,
the other experience I had was when I was in the reserves, we had a base in New Jersey outside Atlantic City, and a number of the reservists came to me and said that, would you consider putting us up in a different hotel on weekends? We're tired of hearing the gunshots from the liquor store being held up 2 doors down, and they were staying at a chain inn there. So we moved them to a Holiday Inn in another area of Jersey there by the airfield.
Okay, I guess in some sense I want to use the question to sort of take a step back from the weeds, because I think the big picture issue is the market's great where the market's great, and where the market doesn't work well, where market accountability doesn't work well, then we have to be honest about it, and in many cases, then public provision is going to be the best bet. So the market works great when it comes to hamburgers in restaurants. The market works great when it comes to cars. These are situations where you have repeat buying. In the case of cars, you've got magazines that tell you about the reliability of a car. So consumers can be very informed and make good decisions based on their own personal experience and sometimes based on research. And so
that sounds a lot like alcohol.
So companies, alcohol's different because of the social impacts, but so companies live or die based on, to some degree, whether or not they do a good job. Then you go to other markets like healthcare or education or infrastructure, where either it's a natural monopoly or you have a situation where, you don't have repeat buying. It's very complex good. Consumers can't make informed choices. So that's where the market doesn't work as well. And so that's go ahead.
Let me ask you this though. Where have you seen, of all of the public-private partnerships that you've looked at in states around the country, do you know of one that's win-win?
I mean, I don't know of any particular one. I mean, I know one industry I know well, where most of the provision is private, is the nursing home industry. And mostly, but not entirely, that's a story of private provision that hasn't worked well. The nursing industry emerged out of the Medicaid in the 1965. By the end of the 1970s, you had books with names like Tender Loving Greed and Unloving Care. So you had stories of elder abuse and financial abuse. And again, mostly this is a story of many for-profit companies that are making money but not delivering quality care. Now, you have had within that industry, both at the high end of the for-profit sector and in parts of the not-for-profit sector, sometimes religiously affiliated, you have had this internal movement to make nursing homes into places to live, not places to die. And so you've had competition and innovation by committed administrators and directors of nursing administration.
So it's a mixed bag.
So there are places within the competition in the nursing home industry that worked out well, as well as places where they haven't.
I'm going to let Ellen weigh in, and then I'm going to take this next call.
One of the things that, to get back to the water issue, you and I don't have, well, I don't know you that well, but I certainly don't have the capacity to go out there and tell whether my water is clean and fit to drink. And so water is sometimes provided by the private sector and sometimes the public sector, but where it is provided by the private sector is where you have a high degree of regulation and testing by the government to make certain that water is pure. There have been a lot of problems with water privatization, and one of the first canaries in the coal mine was in England, where they had privatized a lot of the water, and people were getting ill because the water wasn't clean.
Well, one of the areas that worries me is privatization of prisons, because the incentive, it stands to reason, would be for people to serve longer sentences rather than shorter. So before I take this next call, Leo, how would you respond to privatization of prisons? Is that one area that perhaps is more problematic to you than others?
I think that you would have to be very careful about how it was structured. Private management might not necessarily be a bad thing, and with regards to the issue of sentencing, that's largely out of the hands of the prison. That's more a judicial issue. Are there bad incentives? Yes. We saw in northeastern Pennsylvania the Kids for Cash scandal. So there are problems.
Right. Let me take this last call. Mac from Port Matilda, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, a comment. I was just down yesterday in the Maryland-Virginia area, and on the toll roads there, the Maryland Intercounty Connector and the Virginia Dulles Bypass, I was on those, and the costs there are probably such that the Pennsylvania Turnpike's costs on an equivalent basis would be something like $100 to $150 to transit across there. So there are balances on the other side of the privatization there that I think really have to be understood.
So I think he's saying that the Virginia toll road is much more expensive per mile than even the current Pennsylvania Turnpike, which is true.
But could I make a comment
Sure.
about I just wanted to weigh in on the privatized prisons, and that is, this has actually happened. You have Corrections Corporation of America, which has taken over the operation of a number of prisons. And one of the things that we've seen, for example, in Arizona, is laws that now are allowing people to be put into prison without, just because they've been arrested, not because there's any evidence that they've actually committed a crime. And
perverse incentives here.
Yeah, there's your perverse incentives.
The private prison companies have a vested interest to lobby for longer mandatory sentences, putting people in prison when they're awaiting trial. All of it, and that's those things aren't theoretical. Those things happen.
Go ahead. Then I'd like to wrap things up.
There are, depending on the industry, there can be perverse incentives in the system, and that's why it is incumbent on lawmakers and citizens to be vigilant about the types of laws that are being enacted in their name.
And in order for that to happen, we need to see the contracts. But let me say this. Private investors are poised to spend $250 billion in the next few years on privatization deals around the United States. So I just want to do a quick round robin, just a couple of minutes before we're out of time. What's your advice to citizens and elected officials, Ellen Dannon?
Well, one of the things that I see is that people are reacting toward privatization as though it's a team sport. So you're either going to be waving the banners and the pennants for team private or team public. But there's a reality there that people need to really learn about. And, you know, the information is out there. Thank you for doing this show so that people can get a little bit more information about the nitty-gritty. It's well worth being a citizen of a democracy and spending some time digging into these facts.
The devil is in the details. Go ahead, Leo Knepper.
The devil is absolutely in the details, and it is incumbent on us as citizens to make sure that our elected officials are looking out for our best interest. And when you take a look at the costs that Pennsylvania has in terms of the mileage costs per the cost per mile on highway construction, when you take a look at a lot of things, Pennsylvania could do well to insert some of that privatization in here.
Stephen Herzenberg?
We've actually thought about situations where we could mobilize private capital to invest in sensible ways in a way that's not going to happen currently under government. So one example is energy efficiency. There's a whole national effort to figure out, there's a lot of money on the sidelines in this economy still, and energy efficiency, a lot of energy efficiency would have relatively short paybacks. So if we could have a small amount of government money and set up the financial vehicles, theoretically, you could expand the amount of energy efficiency, save a lot of energy, save money for consumers, create investment opportunities for the private sector. Again, the devil is in the details, and so figuring all that out is demanding. So, yeah, we don't have an ideological position. We do think there are some areas where there's promise, but we also think there are other areas like these natural monopolies, water and sewer, where it's not a good idea.
All right. Well, thanks to all three of you and to our callers. I'm so sorry to Michael from Buffalo Mills that we didn't get your call on. Our guests tonight, Stephen Herzenberg, Leo Knepper, and Professor Ellen Dannon. Thanks so much for being with us. We hope you will join us Thursday, May 9th, when we will take your questions about gardening. For all of us here at WPSU, I'm Patty Satalia. Thanks for joining us, and good night.